Good evening, Ospreys. Good evening, everyone. I'm John O'Loughlin, and welcome to my channel, McDuff_2020. And very busy week for me here at McDuff Channel. I am pretty fired up to replace as quickly as I can my work, my readings, my minefields, my interviews, everything that they took away from me when they purged my YouTube channel. It's really a remarkable thing, and it's got to do with the election, and it's got to do with their paranoia. Their paranoia. They're afraid that we are going to win. When we tell the American people what's really going on behind the curtain, that's what we're all about here at McDuff Channel. We are opening up the doors to the facts that we need. The time of cover-up has got to end. You know, our whole lives can't be spent in cover-up. So, welcome everyone to McDuff Channel, and thanks for being here. We are in Strength of the Wolf by Douglas Valentine, discovering the Federal Bureau of Narcotics as a very, very important agency, both in its own right and also as to a kind of an adjunct of the CIA for secret operations. And I never knew this before, but here we are discovering all kinds of MK Ultra connections that make sense when we haven't been able to see the players before. You know the CIA's involved, but you don't know who the hands are that are actually moving things around and dropping the LSD in people's drinks and things like that. Well, tonight we're moving forward in the book to chapter 20. I am skipping the chapters on the French Connection, which are very, very interesting, and Doug Valentine's expose of the real French Connection is a lot more interesting than the story we've heard from the movie, as real life always is. But Doug wrote it in two chapters, both of which I'm going to skip just for the sake of time, because I want to keep on working on all the other projects I'm doing, and this particular chapter 20, the FBN and the Assassination of JFK, has got to be a part of our work. So let's dig into it. Excuse me just a moment. Okay, the FBN and the Assassination of JFK, page 314 of Strength of the Wolf by Douglas Valentine. Begins with a quote, "And thus the essence of all crime is undivulged," unquote. That from Edgar Allan Poe. In May 1963, Director of Central Intelligence John McCone instructed his Inspector General, Lyman Kirkpatrick, to conduct a review of the MK Ultra program. An OSS veteran and founding father of the CIA, Kirkpatrick had been serving as Inspector General for almost 10 years, and having covered up the Frank Olson death in 1954, would certainly have kept the MK Ultra skeletons in the closet. But he was promoted to executive director in April, and the responsibility for inquiring into the program passed to John S. Ehrman, Jr., an erstwhile member of the Bloodstone Committee that smuggled Nazis out of Europe. Ehrman was a dedicated Cold Warrior, but unlike Kirkpatrick, he knew little about MK Ultra, and what he discovered disturbed him. On the 14th of August, he reported to McCone that MK Ultra was unethical and possibly illegal, that it put, quote, the rights and interests of U.S. citizens in jeopardy, and that subjects often became, quote, ill for hours or days, including hospitalization, a reference to Linda King, in at least one case. But the nature and results of the experiments were buried under so much secrecy he couldn't report comprehensively on what had been tested or what conclusions had been drawn. Only 2 people knew, and they hadn't kept any records. Sid Gottlieb and Richard Helms, the creators of MK Ultra, had tried to cover themselves by not keeping records. But, to their dismay, the new Inspector General had also stumbled across the existence of the FBN safe houses, and he reported what he found out. Ehrman stated that testing at the safe houses had been performed, quote, on individuals at all social levels, including, quote, informants and members of suspected criminal elements from whom the FBN obtained results of operational value. He didn't say what results were obtained by sending hoods on trips to Never Never Land, but he noted that arrangements were made with, quote, police authorities to protect the activity in critical situations, as was the case when Linda King complained to hospital authorities about George White having dosed her with LSD in September of 1953. To further ensure plausible denial, the CIA made sure that the responsibility for handling of the test subjects rested, quote, with a narcotics agent working alone. Gottlieb and Helms had been sure to place responsibility on the few FBN agents involved in MK Ultra, but Ehrman preferred that they not be involved at all. He reported that deep cover agents were more favorably suited than FBN agents when there was a need, quote, to perform realistic testing, unquote. Realistic testing, of course, was a euphemism for field operations, and Ehrman wanted to exclude FBN agents from the potentially compromising activity. But in his response to Ehrman, Deputy Director Richard Helms said, quote, we are virtually obliged to test on unwitting humans, unquote. Did you hear that? Richard Helms said we are virtually obliged to test on unwitting humans. He recommended that the CIA make arrangements with America's principal police departments and prison hospitals, as well as, quote, foreign intelligence or security organizations, with this objective in mind, unquote. Making his feelings perfectly clear, Helms said, quote, our present arrangements with the Bureau of Narcotics appear to me to be the most practical and secure method available to implement this program, unquote. Helms felt that perfecting MK Ultra's offensive capabilities was worth the risk of relying on FBN agents, knowing that, quote, the chief of the Bureau would disclaim any knowledge of the activity, unquote. He also trusted that complicit FBN agents to play along, assuming their proven ability to dissemble would make it impossible to determine exactly what had happened in those safe houses. To some extent, he was right. When asked about the activities at the safe houses, George Gaffney claimed that the CIA used the 13th Street pad only once, while he managed it. At his CIA debriefing in 1977, Charlie Siragusa denied knowing anything about Ike Feldman's safe house at 212 East 18th Street, although he said that Feldman and Ray Treichler ran operations behind his back, and he implied that George Belk knew what they were doing. When called before Congress to testify on the subject in 1977, Belk said that Giordano had briefed him about the safe houses, but that he had no knowledge of what the CIA was doing there, that he had never heard of MK Ultra, and that any documents linking him to it were false. Despite the fact that Gaffney, Belk, and Siragusa complied with the non-disclosure statements they had signed with the CIA, it's clear what the pads were used for. Al-Habib managed the San Francisco safe house after Feldman's transfer to New York in 1961 and acknowledges that there were frequent visits from Sid Gottlieb through 1963. In Chapter 15, John Marks described the types of tests that Gottlieb and his associates conducted at the safe houses starting in 1955. Gaffney has acknowledged that the 13th Street pad was made available to government officials whom the bosses wanted to impress. Agent John Tagley would pick them up at the airport, buy them tickets to a Broadway show, or provide some other form of entertainment, and clean up after they left. Anslinger and Sam Pryor stayed there, as did Gaffney's relatives when they were in town. The pad was so widely used that Gaffney never suspected foul play. Not until former district supervisor Jim Ryan found a wiretap on the phone in the pad. Ryan's shocking discovery made Gaffney wonder if the CIA was tape recording or filming senators with their pants down. If the place was bugged, he muses, conjuring up the specter of political blackmail, it could have been very embarrassing, unquote. As noted earlier, Siragusa assumed that the safe houses were used to uncover defectors within the CIA. According to author Tom Mangold, Angleton bugged at least one Treasury official who entertained important foreign guests and diplomats. And if he did it on one occasion, it's likely that Angleton used the FBN pads to monitor other government officials as well. Political blackmail was not MKUltra's sole purpose. Feldman, in a 1994 article for Spin magazine, said that another purpose was, quote, assassinations, unquote. And indeed, a stated goal of the program was to find out, quote, if an individual can be trained to perform an act of attempted assassination involuntarily. In other words, the CIA was trying to develop mind control techniques, including the use of LSD that could be used to create a push-button assassin who would possess no memory of his deadly deeds. In summation, the FBN safe houses served as bases for counterintelligence operations, political blackmail schemes, training and recruiting of assassins, and, as will become apparent later on, as way stations for CIA drug smugglers. Ehrman did not mention assassins or drug smuggling, but he did say the CIA had perfected, quote, an interrogation theory employing chemical substances. Theory was practiced by 1962 when an Army Special Purpose team traveled to the Atsugi Naval Base in Japan to use LSD during interrogations of foreign nationals suspected of drug smuggling and spying. Tests were also conducted on prisoners in Vietnam, where the CIA was concerned about a regional drug smuggling operation managed by President Diem's brother Nhu through his intelligence service. Clearly, this special purpose team was a cover for CIA officers eager to learn if Nhu's drug smuggling operation had been penetrated by the French, or worse, the KGB or Communist Chinese. Back in the States, the CIA hired, quote, medical specialists to test LSD on prisoners at the Atlanta Penitentiary, and through the National Institute of Mental Health, drug addicts at the Public Health Farm in Lexington. In doing this, Ehrman noted the CIA, quote, buys a piece of the specialist. What he didn't say was that some zealous specialists got carried away with their fiendish research. Dr. Harris Isbell, for example, kept 7 male heroin addicts at Lexington addled on acid for 77 days. A lawsuit was brought against the Army in a similar case, but the Supreme Court ruled against the plaintiff, a soldier named James Stanley, in effect granting the CIA a license to conduct Dachau-style experiments on unwitting American citizens under the aegis of national security. LSD, meanwhile, had become a fad among the eccentric elite. Ambassador Claire Luce enjoyed it immensely, but felt it would lose its appeal once it fell into the hands of the hoi polloi. Scientists searching for a cure for alcoholism also looked into the potentially beneficial uses of LSD, and criminal psychologist Timothy Leary felt it might rehabilitate prison inmates, then realized it had far greater potential. Such was the paradox of the psychedelic. It could drive a scientist like Frank Olson to suicide or make an offbeat hustler like Tim Leary soar angelically. So much depended on the subject's state of mind and the motive of the person administering the drug. Regrettably, the CIA chose to develop LSD as a weapon of unconventional warfare. And once it was determined that the drug was dangerous, the FDA demanded tighter government control over unlicensed distributors. As FDA investigator Frank Larkworthy recalls, LSD became a violation of the Food, Drugs, and Cosmetic Act, and my first LSD case began in 1963 when my supervisor in Los Angeles gave me Al Hubbard as an informant. Alfred Hubbard was in his 60s in 1963. Always dressed in a suit and tie, he was, according to Larkworthy, a conservative businessman bent on acquiring the sole distribution rights for LSD in America. He also had a checkered past. He'd been imprisoned for smuggling liquor to California during Prohibition, but his record was purged in return for his services as a Treasury Department informant and undisclosed services for the OSS. After the war, the Kentucky-born con man became a Canadian citizen and a millionaire through wise investments in airlines and uranium. That's interesting, isn't it? Excuse me a second. However, a transcendental trip in England in 1951 inspired him to restructure his portfolio based on a vision of the world's political leaders achieving enlightenment with the aid of a little acid. By 1955, Hubbard had become the self-appointed Johnny Appleseed of acid in America, and before the drug was outlawed in 1966, had turned on an estimated 6,000 people, including beat gurus Alan Watts, Gerald Hurd, Keith Dittman, and Aldous Huxley, author of The Doors of Perception. Hubbard's pretext for obtaining LSD was his search for a cure for alcoholism, and in 1958 the FDA granted him an investigative new drug permit, allowing him to distribute the psychedelic in the United States. This implies that Hubbard had powerful patrons, most likely the CIA, who guaranteed him a steady source of supply, first from Sandoz, and then, after he got in trouble with the Swiss authorities for not paying export duty on a gram of pure LSD in a bank vault in Zurich, from Chemopol in Czechoslovakia. FDA investigator Frank Larkworthy was unaware of Hubbard's CIA connections, or that he had been an FBN employee, or that George White was probably his case officer, when he acquired him as an informant. He only knew that Hubbard hated Tim Leary and was willing to lead raids on underground labs. This was before Augustus Owsley Stanley found a cheap way to manufacture single doses. An LSD session with a psychiatrist in those days could cost as much as $600, and Hubbard wanted to protect what, for him, was a lucrative business. Hubbard began making cases for Larkworthy, as he had for his previous case officer, Stuart Nadler. A former FBN agent and protege of George White in New York in the early 1950s, Nadler had transferred to Alaska in 1954, then Los Angeles, and was assigned as an administrative aide to White in San Francisco in January 1960. In his book, LSD, The Age of Mind, Roseman describes the bust, which he thought was a robbery, as follows. As Mr. Pilson, in reality an FDA agent, started counting out the money, the kitchen door flew open, and a man raving something holding an automatic rifle bursted in. Roseman, who had purchased his LSD in Israel, was charged with smuggling and selling an unlabeled drug without a license, and was sentenced on several interstate distribution misdemeanors. He went to prison, and Hubbard continued to sell acid trips at $500 a whack, while making cases on his competitors, until the drug was outlawed in 1966, at which point he surrendered 13 grams of pure LSD to Larkworthy. What this means is that for 10 years, the CIA's Dr. Frankensteins had secretly employed LSD, often in FBN safe houses for nefarious purposes, but by 1963 it had escaped to the streets. No longer the exclusive property of the CIA, it was now judged to be a dangerous drug and thus, ironically, a law enforcement issue of concern to the FBN. Pardon me. The return of the Cubans. Ever ready to try any innovation in unconventional warfare, the CIA, in December 1962, enlarged its mercenary army by trading embargoed drugs for anti-Castro Cubans captured during the Bay of Pigs fiasco. Some members of the brigade were sent to secret training camps in Florida and Louisiana to plot murder and mayhem against Castro. Others were sent to fight Congolese rebels, and yet others to stamp out Cuban-inspired brushfire revolutions in Latin America. Wherever they landed, especially in Mexico, these CIA-trained Cuban Contras turned to drug smuggling to finance their operations, and their syndicate would soon join the Kuomintang, French, Italian, and American counterparts as one of the world's premier drug trafficking operations. Manuel Artime is a perfect example of the CIA's lackadaisical attitude toward the drug smuggling activities of anti-Castro Cubans. After his release from prison in 1962, Artime's case officer, E. Howard Hunt, placed him in a leadership role in the terrorist Cuban Revolutionary Council in Miami. Hunt certainly knew that Artime was using drug money to finance his operations in Miami, as did Hunt's bosses, James Angleton, Richard Helms, and Tracy Barnes. As the CIA's domestic operations chief, Barnes was especially well placed to protect Cuban drug distributors. He was in charge of domestic operations involving anti-Castro Cubans and the Mafia. He controlled 64 branch offices across America, and in conjunction with Angleton's counterintelligence staff, he worked with police forces to provide security for CIA safe houses across America, including any in Dallas, Texas. And indeed, drug-smuggling Cubans were involved in MK-Ultra operations in 1963. CIA execution expert Bill Harvey met with Johnny Roselli in June at the same time that Trafficante's Cuban associate, assassin Tony Varona, visited Artime's CRC offices in New Orleans and Miami. Harvey stayed in touch with Roselli after his exile to Rome and thus had an open channel to Trafficante and Verona. There was another Cuban angle as well. In January 1963, prior to his transfer, Harvey had turned his MK-Ultra operation over to Des Fitzgerald, his replacement as chief of Task Force W. And Fitzgerald advanced the Castro assassinations plot through a disgruntled Cuban military attaché, Major Rolando Cubela Secades. The CIA had first asked Cubela to kill Castro in March 1961 at a meeting in Mexico arranged by Cubela's drug trafficking associate Santo Trafficante. Despite Trafficante's exposure as a double agent later that year, Fitzgerald retained Cubela, probably because he enjoyed diplomatic immunity and could travel without his luggage being checked. Fitzgerald, as chief of the CIA's Far East Asia Division, had long been aware of the Kuomintang's narcotics activities, and during 1963 Cubela traveled between Spain, France, Mexico, Prague, and New York, all major transit points in the illicit drug trade. In August, Cubela returned to Havana, and in September he went to Paris to await instructions. Cubela, notably, was a confederate of FBI informer Jose Aleman, the mob-connected financier who in September 1962 heard Santo Trafficante say that JFK was, quote, going to be hit. And that means that Fitzgerald, like Harvey, had an open channel to the patron saint of drug smugglers. The MK-Ultra Shuffle. While the CIA's Cuban and Mafia assets plotted bloody treason, a CIA public relations consultant under the name of Cal Salerno opened a new safe house in Chicago in July 1963 as part of MK-Ultra Subproject 132. Salerno had recently moved his offices from New York, held a top-secret agency clearance, and, as the CIA noted in an internal memorandum, quote, is completely witting of the aims and goals of the project. He possesses unique facilities and personal abilities which have made him invaluable in this kind of operation, unquote. Charlie Siragusa used the alias Cal Salerno throughout his FBN career, but when asked by Senator Edward Kennedy in 1977 if he had set up the Chicago safe house, he said, "There has been some poetic license taken with the truth. I only just learned that the name of Cal Salerno was adopted by others that succeeded me. I had nothing to do with the CIA during that period of time that I was in Chicago." Kennedy accepted Siragusa's denial, even though Siragusa had traveled to Chicago in July 1963 to apply for the job of chief of the Illinois Crime Commission, and while there had socialized with his MK-Ultra liaison, Ray Treichler, who had taken a job with a chemical manufacturing firm in Chicago after retiring from the CIA. So why didn't Kennedy ask the obvious follow-up question and inquire who had impersonated the interviewee and why? Apparently the senator's reticence had to do with the fact that Bobby Kennedy had, concurrently with the establishment of the Chicago Safe House in July 1963, entered into relations with Paulino Sierra Martinez, head of the anti-Castro Junta del Gobierno de Cuba en el Exilio in Chicago. Sierra, on behalf of Bobby Kennedy and with the State Department's support, funded anti-Castro terrorist groups outside of the U.S., perhaps through Siragusa or his impersonator, at the new Chicago Safe House. He was allegedly tied to Trafficante and Marcelo, and if he was, Sierra represented yet a third Cuban named channel, named to the CIA-protected drug smugglers and assassins. Meanwhile, Chicago's besieged mafia boss, Sam Giancana, had revealed his MK-Ultra connections as a way of warding off the FBI. On the 16th of August, the Chicago Sun-Times ran an article titled, quote, CIA sought Giancana help for Cuba slaying. Justice Department sources denied the claim, but at the very same day, Richard Helms sent a memo to McCone regarding the 7th of May 1962 briefing of Bobby Kennedy about the CIA's use of Giancana and Trafficante in its harebrained scheme to kill Castro. It was the first time McCone had heard of any aspect of the scheme to assassinate Castro using members of the gambling syndicate, unquote. CIA murder plots abounded. In April 1963, the agency assassinated Quinim Falsena, the Laotian foreign minister, and in May it tried to kill China's President Li Xiaoqi in Cambodia. In October, President Kennedy authorized the CIA to assist a cabal of Vietnamese generals in the overthrow of President Diem. The generals murdered Diem and his brother Nhu on the 2nd of November, 1963. Well, that's an interesting anniversary. We're reading tonight on the 2nd of November, 2020. In New York, the FBN's gambling squad was closing in on various dignitaries, as well as Meyer Lansky, and other mafia members of, quote, the gambling syndicate, unquote, all of whom were linked to drug trafficking and CIA assassination plots. In Washington, Bobby Kennedy's star witness in the war on crime, Joe Valaki, was revealing the mafia's top secrets, while in Miami, members of the mafia's commission were swearing sacred Italian oaths to murder the entire Kennedy family. The CIA and FBI were also concerned about the uppity Attorney General, whose war on crime was about to expose the skeletons in their respective closets. Time was running out. On the 21st of November 1963, CIA assassin Rolando Cubella traveled from Brazil to Paris, where Des Fitzgerald handed him an MK-Ultra pen loaded with a deadly poison. The pen had been tested in San Francisco by Ike Feldman and George White and was rigged with a hypodermic needle designed specifically for assassinations. The CIA had gone to such extraordinary lengths to kill the annoying dictator of a tiny island, and yet, according to the Warren Commission, a simple Italian bolt-action rifle was employed the next day to kill the President of the United States. I'll never forget that day, Tully Akampora says. Hank Manfredi turned to me and said, quote, they got him. They, in this case, meaning the right-wing ultras who hated Kennedy for, among other imagined offenses, imposing racial desegregation on the sovereign slave state of Texas. The eyes of Texas. Enter Lee Harvey Oswald, the misfit Marine who'd served as a radio operator at the Atsugi Air Base in Japan, where the CIA used LSD to interrogate spies and drug dealers, and where, most likely, they recruited him to work as a double agent in the Soviet Union, and later in a world of mystifying intrigues that ended in epic tragedy. But Oswald was not a drug smuggler or special employee of the FBN, and for the purposes of this book, his role in the assassination is not directly relevant, even if he were the Manchurian Candidate, a magic push-button assassin, or an MK-Ultra patsy programmed to take the fall for the actual assassins. However, the House Select Committee on Assassinations did say there is solid evidence that drug smugglers Carlos Marcello and Santo Trafficante, both CIA million-dollar men, were involved in the murder, and this is an issue that must be explored. The other issue that will be raised in the remainder of this chapter is the utter absence of references to the FBN in any official investigations of the JFK assassination, despite the fact that Bureau informer Jack Ruby killed Oswald, and that, at the HSCA concluded, Ruby had direct contact with associates of Marcello and Trafficante. Ruby's stated motive in killing Oswald was to spare Jackie Kennedy the pain of a public trial, and perhaps that's true. But if Ruby killed Oswald to protect the people who had conspired to kill JFK, were his FBN case agents wittingly involved in the cover-up? The Ruby family have a long history in the illicit drug trade. Jack's older brother Hyman was convicted in 1939 of buying 2 ounces of heroin from Jacob Klein. As described in Chapter 9, Klein slipped away from FBN agents in New York in October 1954 thanks to George White's intervention. And he again avoided arrest by FBN agents in Chicago after Jim Atty's informant was murdered in January 1960. Klein was luckier than Ruby's next partner, Paul Roland Jones. In October 1947, Hyman betrayed Jones to FBN agents in Chicago. According to White's diary, Hyman had been his informant since July 1946. Jack followed in Big Brother's footsteps and served White in 1950, when he briefed the Kefauver Committee about organized crime in Chicago, although his attorney agreed to allow him to testify only on the condition that the Kefauver Committee stay away from Dallas. That raises the question of whether committee investigator George White, who undoubtedly brought Ruby to Kefauver's attention, concurred with this request. If so, why would White want to keep the committee out of Dallas? Was it to deflect attention from the Paul E. Cook mission in Taiwan, which was funded by ultra-Texas oilmen like H.L. Hunt, and which in 1951 was facilitating the CIA Kuomintang drug smuggling operation that entered the U.S. by crossing the Mexican border at Laredo, Texas? There was certainly enough evidence for the Kefauver Committee to take a long look at the Lone Star State. In 1951, Late and Mortimer had identified Hunt as a professional gambler who ran a private racing wire, which suggests mafia ties. They had also claimed that the mafia had taken over the age-old racket of running guns across the border under the aegis of Carlos Marcello. The FBN office in Dallas knew Jack Ruby. Murray A. Brown, the acting district supervisor, on the 22nd of November 1963, described him as, quote, a sleazy opportunist who was always trying to get the Dallas cops to patronize his club. But, Brown says, Ruby was not an FBN informant. George Gaffney, however, vividly recalls Secret Service Chief James Rowley asking him on the 25th of November if the FBN had a file on Ruby. It did, quote, but there wasn't much in it, Gaffney recalls, just that he was a source on numerous occasions, on unimportant subjects. Right after Ruby shot Oswald, Mort Benjamin checked the files in the New York office and found one that indicated that Ruby had been an FBN informer since the 1940s. But the next time Benjamin looked for it, the New York file had gone missing, and Secret Service Chief Rowley never returned the FBN headquarters file to Gaffney, which strongly suggests that someone did not want anyone to know that Ruby had been an FBN informant. Not only did the FBN agents from Dallas disagree with the rest of this outfit about Ruby's status as an informant, the stated focus of their operations is also at odds with Anslinger's legendary obsession with the mafia. Murray Brown, an agent in Dallas from 55 until 76, insists that the mafia was not selling heroin there. Longtime Dallas agent Bowman Taylor agrees. We weren't after the mafia, he says. That's gambling more than dope. New Orleans had the mafia. The small FBN office in New Orleans, which reported to Dallas, had arrested Marcello on a marijuana rap in 1938, and in 1963 it had reasons to believe he was a major narcotics trafficker. He was cited, for example, in the international list as an associate of Frank Coppola's. Furthermore, as the chief of the New Orleans narcotic unit, Clarence Giarrusso, said, it was the FBN's job, not his, to investigate mafia drug smugglers who imported drugs from overseas. But according to agents in New Orleans, they never had the manpower or resources to make a conspiracy case on Marcello, so instead they worked on black addicts who traveled to New York and returned with heroin, leaving the million-dollar man left unhindered, perhaps to plot the murder of the president? JFK's French connection. CIA agent Clay Shaw reportedly joined the Permanent Industrial Exhibition, that's Permindex, in 1957. It was a construction company that built trade centers, hotels, and office centers like the Trade Mart he managed in New Orleans. 10 years later, Shaw would attain notoriety as the person New Orleans District Attorney Jim Garrison charged with conspiring to kill JFK. He was acquitted, and as far as this author is aware, was not involved in drug trafficking. However, his company, Permindex, after moving to Rome in 1961 and reforming itself as the Centro Mondiale Commerciale, was reportedly involved in a cover for the transfer of CIA funds in Italy for illegal political espionage activities. More to the point, Centro Mondiale Commerciale, CMC, was accused of channeling funds to the drug smuggling OAS. Quote, in tracing the money used to finance the July 1961 de Gaulle assassination plots, French intelligence discovered that about $200,000 in secret funds had been sent to Permindex accounts in the Banque de la Crédit International. In 1962, Bannister had dispatched to Paris a lawyer friend with a suitcase full of money for the OAS, reportedly around $200,000. Bannister's money allegedly went to Jean-René Marie Surette, or someone impersonating him, a French army deserter and the OAS representative in southern Algeria. Surette reportedly met in the spring of 1963 with E. Howard Hunt in Madrid, Ultra General Walker in Dallas, and Guy Bannister at 544 Camp Street. In June, he offered the CIA a list of KGB penetrations in the French government. Surette was also reported on the Paris end of drug traffic and had been followed for years by an undercover narcotics agent in Marseille. In 1977, the CIA released a document dated April 1964 titled Jean Surette's Expulsion from the U.S. In this document, the FBI explains that French security officials wanted to know why Surette was expelled from Fort Worth or Dallas 18 hours after the assassination. Surette had been in Dallas on the afternoon of the assassination and had been expelled to, quote, Mexico or Canada. The French had some reason to believe that Surette was plotting to assassinate Charles de Gaulle during his upcoming visit to Mexico, and so naturally they wanted to know about Surette's movements. But the FBI said it had no information on him, And in yet another case of criminal negligence, it never notified the Warren Commission about Suetre. There's more to the story. The CIA knew that dentist Lawrence Alderson in Houston had contacted Suetre in December 1963, while Alderson met Suetre in 1953 while serving as an army officer in France. They worked together on security issues at a French air base. As he did every year, Alderson sent a Christmas card to Suetre, and somehow that came to the attention of the CIA. And the only way that's possible is if the CIA was monitoring Suetre. People were tailing Alderson within days of the assassination, and FBI agents interviewed him around the 1st of January 1964, 4 months before the French officials contacted the FBI. The FBI wanted to know if he would act as a go-between if Suetre contacted him again. That never happened, but Alderson told the writer that these persons claiming to be agents of the Army CID told him that Suetre had been flown from Dallas to New Orleans on the 22nd of November 1963 on a military transport plane. No one from the U.S. government ever asked Suetre if he was in Dallas on the 22nd of November, but if he wasn't there, and we know a Frenchman was, it may have been SDECE agent Michel Mertz impersonating him. Mertz, when compared to Suetre, is an equally, if not exceedingly, enigmatic character. Born in 1920 in Moselle, France, he was drafted into the German army, but ostensibly defected to the resistance. After the war, he joined or infiltrated, as the case may be, SDACE undercover as a French army captain. He served a tour in Algeria with Suetre, and in April 1961 returned to Algeria as a double or perhaps triple agent. He presented himself as an OAS sympathizer and either learned of or provoked an OAS plot to assassinate de Gaulle in July. In either case, the plot was foiled. France rallied around de Gaulle, and Mertz won the eternal gratitude of Interior Minister Roger Frey and his chief aide, Alexandre Sanguinetti, Marcel Francisqui's protector in the French government. In 1947, Mertz married the adopted daughter of Charles Martel, a Paris procurer and drug smuggler with connections to François Spirito. It's unthinkable that such a liaison would escape the notice of Charlie Dyer, the veteran FBN agent who worked in France throughout the 1930s, but Mertz was unknown to the FBN, and in 1960, with the blessings of his bosses, he established a lucrative heroin network between France, Montreal, and New York under the auspices of Spirito's partner Joe Orsini. Santo Trafficante and Orsini's former cellmate Benny Indiviglio, the mafia's distributor in Dallas, managed the American end of the operation. A significant delivery was made in October 1961, just prior to the French Connection case, when Mertz's courier, diplomat Jean Mounet, accompanied a citron packed with 100 pounds of heroin to New York. Mounet may have been posing as J. Morin, and if so, Mertz may have been the guiding hand behind Jean Jehan, François Scalia, and Jean Angelvin. Apart from any attention he may have attracted if involved in the famous French Connection case, deliveries from Mertz to Indiviglio, averaging 90 kilograms a month, would continue undetected for the next 9 years. Extrapolating on the fascinating information presented in this chapter, one can hypothesize that an assassin used Paul Mondolone's protected drug route in Mexico to enter Texas through Laredo and to exit through Houston or New Orleans. Suetre was probably willing to do the hideous deed for money to support the OAS. Mertz was a professional assassin and may have been acting on behalf of the CIA faction within the SDECE. CIA counterintelligence chief James Angleton was capable of moving the assassins through his Brown-Castellani network. His staff had a phony 201 file on Oswald and, through MKUltra, could have set up Oswald as the patsy. Last but not least, William Harvey, who hated Bobby Kennedy, and Desmond Fitzgerald, the far-right Republican, had access to Corsican assassins and the Marcello Trafficante Bonanno Mafia clique that could have maneuvered Jack Ruby and the Dallas police. As outlined in Chapter 15, Harvey recommended hiring Corsican drug smugglers as assassins in order to protect certain mafiosi in the CIA's employ. He also wanted to turn Corsicans working for the Soviets into double agents, which brings us to the final piece of the puzzle. In an incredible coincidence, Angleton met on the 22nd of November 1963 with Colonel de Lauriane at Le Rive Gauche restaurant in Georgetown regarding allegations made by Philippe de Vosjoli, the FBN agent Sal Vizzini's partner in operations into Cuba during the 1962 missile crisis, that Colonel Leonard Ono, deputy head of SDECE, was a KGB agent. De Vosjoli, however, proved to be a double agent working for Angleton against his own government, and according to Angleton's biographer Tom Mangold, Uno was exonerated. The CIA acknowledged that de Vosjoli had given bad information and that de Gaulle was so upset that he severed relations with the CIA over the incident. The consequences of this split were serious and benefited only the KGB. It's almost as if Angleton was a double agent, and if he was the mole he was searching for, it's possible that SDECE agents working for the KGB may have sent an assassin into Dallas through Angleton's Brown-Castellani drug network, or through Paul Mondolone. If Angleton was a KGB mole, perhaps he used QJ/Win, who could have been Mertz, to assassinate JFK, and programmed Lee Harvey Oswald as the unwitting patsy through the MKUltra program. Speculation such as this will always surround the unsolved assassination of JFK. Angleton was, like White, debilitated by his alcoholism, and the problems he caused may well have been the result of incompetence rather than malice. So this chapter will close by returning to where it started, to Erie, EERIE, MKUltra. On the 29th of November 1963, a week after the president was murdered, Marshall Carter, the deputy director of the CIA, met with Richard Helms, John Ehrman, James Angleton, Sidney Gottlieb, and Lyman Kirkpatrick. What a group! At this meeting, the CIA chiefs agreed to continue to test unwitting subjects through MKUltra using the FBN and its safe houses. To this end, they launched MKUltra Subproject 149 in New York in January 1964, specifically to provide a replacement for Charlie Siragusa. An unnamed individual in the import and export business conducted the project at least until April 1965. These CIA officers, especially Angleton, had the desire and the ability to mold assassins and patsies. The three main suspects in the assassination, Marcello Trafficante and Hoffa, were CIA million-dollar men, and the CIA prevented the FBN from going after these drug traffickers or investigating CIA agents like Irving Brown and perhaps Michael Mertz, in Angleton's French Connection, all of which forms an unmistakable trail leading from the CIA through the FBN to the assassination of JFK. Well, that is an interesting angle, and speaking of Angleton, once again, this FBN is a very useful agency for the CIA, and the idea that they could have been part of setting up the OAS assassins or the Corsican assassins is certainly a reasonable idea to me. We are not quite sure yet exactly who it was, but we do believe it was more likely the Europeans that were working with OAS through Angleton probably, than it was the actual mafia in the United States, at least as far as pulling the trigger is concerned. But more will be revealed. Thanks a lot, guys. Glad to have you with me tonight. We'll see you in the morning for part 2 of The Secret Team Revisited here on McDuff Channel, 11 o'clock in the morning. We'll see you then.